Well, everybody, I know that the last thing eating at lunch, so I'll try and get through this. I didn't do a 90-second slide because I thought I could talk for 90 minutes. So we'll try and pack it fast. We're going to talk about different unmanned aircraft systems that we've tested in different scales, either directly for enforcement and surveillance in protected areas or show data that they've acquired and kind of make a sort of a case of what makes sense for different kinds of places. Hopefully we'll look at that. So it gives some formatting issues. So a brief history of how we tested systems, looking at marine resource monitoring and enforcement applications, to looking at what's over the horizon. Hopefully we'll have a minute or two to go at the end. So there's four real categories of unmanned aircraft systems. That's how the military and FAA class them. From high altitude, long endurance, that includes platforms like the Global Hawk, which we talked about just briefly yesterday. Medium altitude, long endurance, most familiar to most people would probably be the Predator class, but also the Scan Eagle, which we also discussed a little bit yesterday, fits into that realm. Low altitude, long endurance, I'll show a couple slides. That would include the Aeroson, which I'll show you and explain it. And mostly what I'm going to talk about is low altitude, short endurance. These are small UAS, and these are the things that the FAA is going to be opening up a little. We don't know how much or even exactly when, but supposedly within the next year there'll be new regulations that will open up some commercial applications for systems below 50 products in the national level. So you hear a lot about unmanned aircraft systems making sense for the dirty, dull, and dangerous missions, and that's really sort of how the military looks at it. But I think for the work that we do, there's some other attributes that are worth mentioning. Remote. The more remote you get, the more sense it makes, especially if you're getting there on a ship, to have the ability to extend your effective area, being able to survey or scan the ocean or the shore. Also, a lot of the small systems are very quiet and very stealthy. After all, the ones that were designed for the military were designed to be over the horizon situational awareness tools, relatively expendable at that. So they're stealthy by design. So they're very innocuous, most of them. They don't disturb sensitive organisms when you're surveying. And it's actually also hard to see them if you're being surveyed, if you're a person or a poacher or what have you. Also, you can get a persistence out of something that you may not have thought about, even if it only has a battery to fly for 2 hours. Usually you can turn them around in a matter of minutes, or you bring more than one airframe, and you can be up all day long. And you can, many of them will allow you to lock a pixel on a target. Those that have payloads that actually have a gimbal, which means you can get a stable center of field of view photograph for a very, very long time. Longer and often better. I can't show you the rest of that slide. So where do we start? In the upper left, you see Altair. That was a pre-production Predator B. We partnered with General Atomics who built the system in NASA in 2005 for a pilot project that was really looking at, how can we start to implement this kind of technology in NOAA. And that was, I think we heard about the Frank and I yesterday. I called this the Franken payload. We put together a payload that wasn't really optimized for any one NOAA activity, but it was representative of many. And we collected a lot of data and looked at it and we realized we should keep pursuing this. And so from the UAS project through the UAS program office, and I've been involved since the beginning there, late 2004. Lower right, and we're kind of going through the big scale stuff first, is that's a Global Hawk. That is a obsolete military jet-powered unmanned aircraft that Northrop Grumman built. This is sort of the first block, if you will, of them. There were 3 blocks. The third is still being used for something. This first class of them, NASA has 3 at in the Mojave Desert at what's now the Armstrong Flight Research Center. They've been reconfigured to support science. We have several NOAA Corps officer pilots that are on detail to NASA helping fly these, and we fund a lot of payloads and missions on these. They're mostly being used now for sort of pseudo-satellites, and they're being used for advanced weather and climate change kind of research. It's not to say they couldn't carry instruments that might be very, very interesting for marine protected area surveillance, large-scale areas, anywhere in the world. They have a 13,000-mile range. They can carry a couple thousand pounds of instrumentation. Compartments that are pressurized or unpressurized, that can be in the airflow or not. So they're an interesting idea. These were $60+ million new, obsoleted, within a decade or so of being built, because they built bigger ones to haul bigger telescopes, basically. But the point is, some of this equipment, it would fly for 30 years like most airplanes, but it's becoming obsolete technologically on something closer to Moore's law. So you start thinking about it, what can you pick up for nothing and reconfigure? Some very expensive, very capable equipment's out there. The middle slide, I kind of added in because it's tangent to marine protected area stuff, but the whole ghost net and persistent marine debris issue. And we've been studying this and supporting NOAA's Marine Debris Office, helping test different parts of this concept, which I call planes, trains, and automobiles. But what you have in the upper right is a satellite. We've proven a couple times by flying out to the garbage patch in the North Pacific Convergence Zone that we can find high-density areas of marine debris where we can find the garbage patch. And so satellites help us do that. I won't get into how, but it works. And the idea here is, instead of having people cut the nets out manually in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, for example, each summer, when they're already into the reefs and the atolls on the beaches, would be the holy grail is to get them at sea. So in this concept, we have a satellite help us get a ship in the vicinity. Then we have a global hawk or a predator flying probably a synthetic aperture radar payload that can actually image the surface of the sea and show you micro circulatory features and buoys and things like that that are being trained and would indicate nets. And then a small unmanned aircraft that the ship would carry that would vector the ship to individual nets in a high density area. So we're talking about something that can fly at 50 knots if we launch in the current sea, vector to ship that can go 10. Again, all about getting it at sea. So flying a predator or a global hawk predator, and this, of course, much of this was building a payload, but the point is, it takes a village. It's a big, expensive undertaking. The Global Hawk probably takes an army. This is the NASA Global Hawk Operations Center. In front of the glass wall are the operators that are actually flying and monitoring the health of the aircraft. Behind the glass wall is the science party, people that are dealing with the payload. So a lot of labor involved in making these things happen. Upper left is Icana. So following that Predator testing, NASA actually bought an MQ-9 Predator B. It's named Icana. It's not weaponized, it's for science. And we're taking it for the first time out into the northwestern Hawaiian Islands this summer. It's out there to support RIMPAC, which is actually a military exercise, but it's just providing imaging. And it's going to be configured as a Coast Guard / CBP Guardian with synthetic aperture radar, really powerful optics, and AIS. And I'll talk a little bit more about that payload, how we're going to use it in flight this coming summer. This is a big event. We had intended to take Altair in 2005 out to do that, and we didn't get to. Below is a Scan Eagle recovery on a small boat. I'll talk about where I think the Scan Eagle might fit into a big strategy later in my talk. To the right, Manta, one of the systems that we do own and we use occasionally for mostly air quality work. There's the Aerosonde, also in 2005, I believe, before it was launched. I believe that was to Hurricane Ophelia. Again, some products that we have in our inventory that from the early days. Here's a Scan Eagle that was deployed on a NOAA ship, or at least this represents that mission. We're we were in the Arctic to survey and characterize 4 different types of Arctic seals in 2009. One thing I'll mention about this, although we thought the test was really successful, up until the last minute, we thought we were going to be able to fly 50 miles away from the ship. And unfortunately, before the FAA's COA, their certificate of authorization that was required for us to operate in the national airspace, reduced us to only 5 miles. And so there's a lot of things that we've been able to test or prove here and there, but we can't really do operationally yet because of the rules and policies. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. We own a few different kinds of quadricopters and hexacopters. We've tested them doing a lot of wildlife survey. Generally, I think not very effective tools for MPA enforcement. They don't have the range. Because it takes so much electrical power to get them airborne, they don't fly for very long. They do, however, have some really interesting applications. They provide very stable, very, very high resolution imagery. So we do use them for some things, but not for enforcement. We've tested different schemes. We've tested different schemes to launch and recover unmanned aircraft from vessels, and the systems that we're using regularly are simply hand launched and recovered in the water. It's the most reliable way to do it. We are moving with AeroVironment. We've manufactured the system that we use the most towards testing some net capture for remote areas and operating from ships. And that's only in places where it's actually more dangerous than people in the water to recover the aircraft, or we're operating from a large vessel where the captain doesn't want to stop the ship to recover a 13-pound aircraft. But generally, we like to recover them in the water. So again, back to our sort of most recent history, the work we've done the most with the small aircraft system, the Puma. We acquired 2 brand new Puma unmanned aircraft systems from AeroVironment through a contract vehicle that the Army had. This is military hardware. This was developed for the Special Operations Command. We have about 1,000 of these in production now. This is sister to the Raven, which is the most prolific unmanned aircraft system in the DoD inventory. After looking at a whole lot of systems, we realized we needed to buy things that had extensive training, parts availability, ability to be successfully launched and recovered at sea. And there are only a couple systems on the market, at least in the last few years, that can really do all those things. Not inexpensive, but when you look at these things, it's over $300,000 per system. You look at them as a ship data acquisition system. You're talking about ships that cost $20,000 to $30,000 a day to be anyway, plus the cost of 20 to 40 people on it. In fact, it only costs pennies a day to operate. It makes a lot of sense, and the cost becomes down to the weeds, operational day by day. So we've been working the past 2.5 years using National Marine Sanctuary sites as laboratories to develop the protocols and procedures for various missions and identifying the ones that the Puma system does best. And we've done a lot of marine resource surveys, and we're going to do some slides. A fair amount of enforcement work in Hawaii, California, and Florida. Done some mapping, supported some oil spill drills, working a lot with the Marine Debris Program, and we took a system up to the Arctic last year with the Coast Guard. I will say that MPA enforcement, fisheries enforcement, is one of the killer apps, in our opinion, for producing small UAS, and nighttime especially. So quick run through on the Puma AE, 9-foot wingspan, 13 pounds, built of carbon fiber, electrically powered. It is controlled through this little hand controller, which runs through a Toughbook laptop that has the ground control equipment on it. It's very durable. We've operated it everything from 200-foot long ships down to 11-meter long rigid hull inflatable boats, taking waves over the top. It works in that environment. Generally, in our configuration, we export out the data real time to a large TV monitor. if we're on a big vessel. If not, we've incorporated some things that we've just bought on the open market, like gamer goggles, little LCD TV tablets that allow the scientists that we're working with to have a real-time view of the data without having to bother, if you will. They give direction to the operators of the system, but in ways that they don't have to share the same display. You do every once in a while run into people getting seasick by looking at these monitors, especially at night. So there are some problems with that, and we run into rules regularly that have to get looked at, because as a default, we use the same rules for our pilots when they're flying airplanes, when they're flying unmanned aircraft systems. And so they have to have a flight surgeon tell them they can take any sort of medicine and move the counter. So at first people couldn't take Dramamine or have scopolamine pass on the boat unless a flight surgeon told them they could. So every time we run into something like that doesn't make sense as we're building our procedures, we get fixed, but sometimes it holds up. So this is a kind of quick view on a bigger boat of what an enforcement day look like. Usually when we do enforcement testing, we put together a task force. We'll work with Cal Fish and Wildlife, Coast Guard, National Park Service down at the Channel Islands, and our own Office of Law Enforcement folks. Right now, we're collecting data and demonstrating how these tools can be used. There's policy and, I'll say, privacy concerns have driven the policies that are not allowing us to currently make cases with unmanned aircraft systems, although we can still use them to queue people. So I mentioned the remote video terminals where we export out the signal. Anywhere within the line of sight, and for the Puma that's about 20 kilometers when we're flying, we can tap into that data stream and add another video receiver. It's like an active ground control unit. Basically that hand controller that you saw in an earlier slide, they're waterproof. We've put them on ridge and hull inflatables too. So even the boarding teams can be looking at aerial imagery of the boat that they're going to be boarding. And that's especially comforting at night for boarding teams, if they can see what's on the deck, especially if they're looking out in the lights when they're boarding the boat, as well as the rest of the people supporting them, say, Coast Guard cutter or fishing vessels. So and some of these fishermen are pretty rough, especially the people that work at night. They might be up. There was one bus where they were actually cooking against on one of the boats. This was a few years ago, Santa Barbara Channel, Coast Guard had to figure out, what do we do with these guys? So they had to follow them in. So the data from the Puma system, it's line of sight. So if you want to redistribute it to people beyond where you are within this 20 kilometers of line of sight, you have to export it out via to the internet via satellite or microwave or whatever. And we've done a few drills where we have done that, where we sent real-time full motion streaming video to instant command centers. It's like an experiment on top of an experiment. Every time we do it, we kludge together these ways to get the data exported. That might be something for this group, or we would consider some of the things we discussed yesterday. To get remote data out would be very useful. There's a couple slides showing the kind of data you get. You get the telemetry on top of every image, and it's all recorded in the console, and you can exploit it in different ways. But you get the center point of every image. You get the four corners. You get their X, Y. You get slant range. You get the elevation speed of the vehicle. Much other data fields. And we can show these images with or without the telemetry overlays. You can also pull higher resolution still images than just individual stills that are coming through all the time. You can switch back and forth. You can toggle from infrared to optical, and the IR can be shown in either white or black. This is sort of representing a task force. Coast Guard still doesn't allow launch and recovery from their vessels of unmanned aircraft systems, but we could get around it, and we have got around this by working on 110 and 87-foot cutters by having the active ground control on NOAA vessels, and then just sending the passive signal to the Coast Guard cutter. So that's one way we've got around it. but I think that's all evolving. Coast Guard is starting to be more interested in small systems. I want to mention environmental parameters. The small systems that we've tested, it seems like in the book for the Puma actually uses a 25 knot wind limit, for its envelope, and it all does start to fall apart right about there. It's harder to recover the system. That's just about where it's no fun. Put a small boat in the water, pick something up without running over. The images start to lose their stability. That's about what that wing can take. We've launched and recovered in higher winds than that, but you have to think about where you're operating, what the conditions are regularly, before you go to deploy the smaller things. And we've tested the WASP and other waterproof small UAS as well that have less limits. So this seemed to fit us pretty well. I'll show you some sort of resource test slides that we've done. This was a mock seal and turtle in Hawaii that was during some marine retesting we were doing after the tsunami. Just showing different scales of the same things we were looking at here. Right? We realized that you had to be able to image it to be able to find it. So this was the image of it. We've supported a lot of different wildlife surveys. This is blue whales being tagged in the Santa Barbara Channel. A couple interesting things about this image when you think about it. And I'm sorry, this is a beautiful sharp image that fell apart in PowerPoint. But this was taken with about a 250-foot cloud deck. We were flying under the clouds, and we were able to, this choreography of a whale being tagged with a suction cup tag on a line pole can take an hour or two to get it all synced up so that the rigid hull inflatable is right there as the whale surfaces, to get the tag in the right place adjacent to the dorsal, and back off without hurting the whale. And so we were able to actually, with the remote video terminal on the rigid hull inflatable, be talking through, and the guys could see themselves where the whale was going to surface next, so they could be in position. And besides that, some of the later images from the series, they can also verify where on the whale the tag was put, and then they could scale the whale on the size of the rib boat against the whale because they know there's a 20-foot long boat. There's a whole lot of information you can get, and it makes it safer for everybody and much more efficient by supporting these with an unmanned aircraft. You couldn't get these shots. And there's an amazing series of shots from Hawaii. If you prop wash and you beat the water out, you beat the wrong place all the time. You'd have to go back and get gas 2 or 3 times. So, there's a lot of really interesting things you can do with these. On the Washington outer coast, the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, and the Washington National Wildlife Refuges along the coast. This summer, we're going back. We'll do our last comparison with the helicopter service that they do annually. The year after that, I think we're going to stop using the helicopter because we're getting better data. We're not disturbing the critters. We're flying within 200 feet of them, and they're landing in the colony. And that's habitat mapping, a whole other discussion we can have about utilities of these things. Emergency response, onboard tools where you can lay out digital calipers. This is a simulated oil spill. We're looking at some fluorescent dye in the ocean. You can set a center point. You can measure the drift, the rate of drift and the speed. You can put 2 axes on it and quantify how big a blob is. This is where you're starting to beat the Mach 1 island. You can actually make a quantitative assessment of how big something is. So here's an IR black hot image on the right of a squid fishing boat at night in the Channel Islands. You have everything you need to make a case right there in the photo if somebody's in the wrong place at the right time. Mentioned the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. This is Tern Island, our big campaign on the Predator this summer. We've dubbed it, this is where we'll do a lot of the work. It's about 350, 400 miles offshore, pretty remote. We're doing this campaign with NASA because every science campaign gets a name. It's turn. We get a theme song out of it. So here's the predator that we're going to take out there. Now we're talking about a whole other scale and complexity and cost, but really sort of unique capabilities where this can fly for 20 hours. It can go more than a couple thousand miles and has a payload that will actually allow us to quantify every vessel, to be able to identify every vessel that we may encounter out in that area. And people have been sleeping at night with this sort of null hypothesis that there's nobody out there, except for the people that we know are out there because they have these VMS transponders where they provide these notices and get permits. But that may not be true. We're going to be able to prove what a system like this could do. And it'll be really interesting if we do find a person or persons out there that wasn't supposed to be, and that could be a game changer. In my opinion, which could be eventually a small UAS being on ships all the time to be able to actually understand compliance and use of a vast area like that. But with this system, we'll be able to, the radar actually finds the boats on the surface within 100 miles of its swath, and then it cues the optics and the infrared. We'll also be able to validate the satellite AIS data that's collected and analyzed, cross-reference that to what the satellites collect. So this shows you some of the imaging that you can get from a system like this. This is from 20 miles away. The people in the life raft are from about 9 miles away. We'll be flying at 23,000 feet. That's where the radar is optimized. And then we'll circle down to about 6,000 feet when we want to maximize our resolution. So there was a lot of talk yesterday about where to conduct tests. And, this slide shows special use airspace. This military airspace that's either warning or restricted areas. And as a federal agency, we can schedule these areas. Some of them cost money, some don't. We've done a lot of work off point of view. And this slide depicts the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. And that would be the blue boundary, the state boundary, and the national park boundary within that. The Channel Islands MPAs are shown in red and blue. And then the military warning areas that can be scheduled are all this green area. So you can see the whole Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, except for the east end of Santa Cruz on one side, is within one or another of these. And so by scheduling these areas with point of view, we're able to fly beyond line of sight, things that we can't do under a COA or with our agreement with the FAA. Similarly, Barking Sands at PMRF allows us to go hundreds of miles offshore by working with the military and doing things with things. So my last couple slides, and I'm sorry if I'm running a minute late, I want to mention latency and utility of data real briefly. There's real-time data. That's what you really need for queuing enforcement assets. You can't land 10 hours later and go out and find something. So you got to have data. If it's recording on board, that's great for characterization, post-processing, things like that. And the near real-time stuff can be used